Dear class, dear classes, since I'm sending this out to all of you, I must thank you and the coronavirus, for having introduced me to the pleasures of a short talk, which I would never otherwise have discovered. And I'm hoping that you might indulge me if I go out on a limb today for the pure pleasure of doing so, and talk a little about how to read poetry. We haven't had any poetry in our tragedy class, which is devoted to dramatic literature, and not much in our Irish literature class, not as much as we could have, just a quick taste of Yeats. However, if you feel this might be of wider interest to any of you, then that would make me very happy. How to read poetry is an ambivalent term. How to read it aloud on the one hand, and how to read it, how to understand it. Neither of these subjects can possibly be comprehensively dealt with, but maybe a few thoughts on the subject might come in handy. I wanted to use two poems. Begin with a famous, perhaps I should say a once famous poem called Sea Fever. It's hyphenated, Sea-Fever, written by John Masefield, who enjoyed a long and successful career as a writer. He was poet laureate of Britain. He wrote plays and novels and long poems and all manner of things. He wrote nothing more extraordinary, however, than this short poem, which was published when he was 24, maybe written when he was barely out of his teens. And while this remarkable achievement of this once immortally celebrated, or perhaps mortally, if it's no longer known, to have written something like this when you're that young could blight a whole career, it didn't blight his. He had a very eminent and long career. So he went to sea very early, age 16, on a voyage to Chile, and of his early travels came this astounding hymn of praise to the joys of being on the open sea. It goes like this. Well, I'm going to read it in the original because there's an extra syllable that he introduced later on because other people kept introducing it, but I'm going to introduce it. I'm going to not introduce the extra syllable. I'm going to read it as he wrote it. And it goes like this. I must down to the seas again, to the lonely sea and the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by, and the wheels kick, and the wind's song, and the white sails shaking, and a grey mist on the sea's face, and a grey dawn breaking. I must down to the seas again, for the call of the running tide is a wild call and a clear call that may not be denied. And all I ask is a windy day with the white clouds flying, and the flung spray and the blown spume, and the seagulls crying. I must down to the seas again, to the vagrant gypsy life, to the gull's way and the whale's way, where the wind's like a whetted knife. And all I ask is a merry yarn from a laughing fellow rover, and quiet sleep and a sweet dream when the long trick's over. So there it is, and you may read it aloud any way you please. And I want to draw attention to its extraordinary properties as music. It is its own music. It's not written to any of the patterns familiar to writers and readers of English verse. It has a sway and a swing to it, which are all its own. That extra syllable It's right at the beginning. He wrote, "I must down to the seas again." Now, when he wrote it, in the early years of the 20th century, or perhaps even the waning years of the 19th, you could say that. I must down. You could lose the word go. I must down to the seas again was perfectly, there was nothing odd about it. But as the 20th century proceeded, people had lost that locution, and they thought that a word had been missed out. so that what they did was they supplied it. And in the end, Masefield put it in himself, and it became, you'll find it mostly printed as "I must go down." That is a slightly different rhythm. I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea in the sky. But it's the syncopation of his lines that is so strikingly beautiful about this poem, and they're greatly added to by losing the go and just saying, "I must down." So you don't supply the little additional go which steps in and helps the verse along as though it was an old man in need of support at that moment. It isn't. I must down to the seas again. And the important thing is to the seas. The anapiste is the term for that in formal prosody. And it's greatly aided to the seas, which is all the energy of, I've got to go, to the seas. And that's stronger if it's, I must down to the seas, not go down to the seas again, which is altogether too sing-song. So I must down to the seas again, to the lonely sea in the sky. And that then supports you to the lonely sea in the sky. And all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. Many wonderful S's already, the correct consonant really for verse about water, about the sea, the seas, the lonely sea in the sky, that all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. And the wheels kick again, the way in which the unreliable movement of a ship on the sea is mimicked in the poem, which will suddenly it will rear up on a wave. And that's what you feel in the wheels kick and the wind's song and the white sails shaking. And now he introduces that feminine rhyme with the extra syllable, shaking, which so perfectly evokes what the white sail is doing, shaking. It just keeps the line going for a little bit longer as the white sail shakes. So you have three items there. The wheels kick, and you can feel, if you're at the wheel trying to control it in a high sea, you feel the kick in the wheel. And the wind's song, the wind is indifferent to the kicking of the wheel and the leaping of the waves. It has its own song. And the white sails shaking. And a grey mist on the sea's face. Wonderful that the sea here has a face with a grey mist on it. And a grey dawn breaking. He's already a master, and the breaking echoes the shaking so beautifully. He's already a master of repetition, the repeating of which we'll find again later in the last stanza, where he talks of the gull's way and the whale's way, not trying to find a new word, but exploiting the force of repetition. He uses it again in the second stanza. It's a wild call and a clear call. And the echo is so strong, like a grey mist on the sea's face and a grey dawn breaking. It's verse, it's poetry that forces you into its own rhythm, its own extraordinary originality of melody. You have no choice. And a grey mist on the sea's face, and a grey dawn breaking. You have no other way to pronounce it. And so it's a lesson in following. I can see that I'm not going to get to the end of this poem before my 15 minutes are up. Your 15 minutes are up, sir. He goes on, I must down to the seas again. The seas, generic, all seas, become in that first line of the first stanza, the lonely sea and the sky. So he moves from the seas of the world that reach all the different shores of all the continents of the world, the seas. But it's only one sea, the lonely sea in the sky, that you step onto on your ship, or into on your ship. So I must down to the seas again, the second stanza, for the call of the running tide, and we get 3 calls here, is a wild call and a clear call that may not be denied. And all I ask, the same figure as in the second line of the poem in the first stanza, and all I ask is a windy day. So, first of all, and all I ask is a tall ship. They were always known as the tall ships, those wonderful ships with incredibly tall masts. Wonderfully tall they were, too. And all I ask is a windy day with the white clouds flying. So he's not saying, all I ask is a nice, calm afternoon in the midst of the sunshine. On the contrary, what he wants is a high wind and the white clouds flying above in imitation of the sails on the sea, in invitation to the wind. And all I ask is a windy day with the white clouds flying. And again, we're evoking shaking and breaking and now flying, and the flung spray and the blown spume. The spray is all of the water that comes splashing up, flung by wind and water, and the spume is the froth that is produced on the top of the waves, the blown spume, and the seagulls crying. When you get to that line, and the seagulls crying, it completes the picture, and suddenly you hear it as well as see it. And it's incredibly powerful, and you think, yes, I get it. The windy day, the white clouds, the seagulls crying, of course, they're a part of the drama. And so on to the third. I must down to the seas again, this compulsively repeated trope, this description of the compulsion that sailors have so often felt throughout history. You get back with great relief to the land and your loved ones, and in many cases you swear never to go to sea again. You certainly swear to your loved ones never to go to sea again, and gradually creeps up on you the irresistible urge for the adventure of the sea. So here it comes again. I must down to the seas again, to the vagrant gypsy life. And he admits that that's what the life is. It's not an alternative life on the sea. It's an alternative to life, the gypsy life. To the gull's way and the whale's way. And of course, way here has both its meanings. This happens to be where the gulls apply their way, and the whales too, but it's also the gull's way of living. The gull's way and the whale's way, they too are vagrant gypsies, where the winds, like a whetted knife, whetted and wetted, with and without the H, are so close here. So the wind is sharp and bitter, this isn't a pleasant breeze on a sunny day. And all I ask, and these last 2 lines are so sweet, and all I ask, they are putting the whole agony of longing to bed. And all I ask is a merry yarn from a laughing fellow rover, your pal, who has a comic tale to tell, and quiet sleep, and a sweet dream. Those 2 E's are so lovely. Quiet sleep and a sweet dream when the long trick's over. And what a kick in the tail this poem has. Trick was the technical term, both for a voyage and for a spell on duty at the wheel or at the, you could be at the helm or you could be at the rail, you could be up in the crow's nest looking out. That would be your trick. It's your trick, your turn. And of course, the long trick, quiet sleep and a sweet dream when the long trick's over. Life is a long trick. It's so powerful that because it's both a long journey and a long spell at the wheel and a long trick. Life is a trick. So the word trick has been turned by young Masefield into this magnificently ambivalent requiem for life. Life is a long trick, a long journey, and quiet sleep and a sweet dream when the long trick's over. To rhyme with fellow rover. It's so good, this poem. I'm only surprised that he didn't give up poetry. I don't know how you'd go on having produced this. He must have known it was pretty good. It's beyond pretty good. It's one of the great short poems in the history of poetry. And how do you go on after that? Well, you go on because you don't know that it's actually immortal, and you may think you have many other immortal poems in you. He didn't. He had much excellent poetry and much excellent writing and great success. But to repeat a poem like that, I don't think even Shakespeare would have presumed. So that's it. Thank you for the moment. I'm going to come back with a little second one, if I may, because I had intended to go on to a Shakespeare sonnet. So I'll do that in a separate installment. Thank you for watching, if you have been. Bye.